Hello, my name is Daniel Scuria-Herman, and today I'll be speaking on the topic of the Space Force. Before sinking my teeth into it, I should specify where I got the idea to make this video, and that was from this.
I'm Brandon, active duty, United States Space Force.
Oh, sick.
Space Force? That's so cool! Oh my god, so he's like an astronaut oh my god, he's a space ranger. That's so cool. What a world we live in, you know? Everyone always likes to complain about like everything going wrong with the world. We have space rangers. You know? Isn't that cool? Man. That's space ranger. Immediately upon seeing this guy, I was blown away by the existence of a space force, and even more so from the fact that everyone acted so nonchalant about it. So if there are others who are unaware of this faction of the military like I was before making this video, and this is for you. Now, of course, this idea seems very silly, and in my search for information on this subject, I received primarily content intended to mock the existence of this part of the military. While of course, I should mention that I do like sci-fi, I am fascinated by the idea of this force. I do realize where some of the hesitance people have for this comes from. I don't know when you, the viewer, are seeing this video. Perhaps if YouTube lasts long enough, you're watching it a century from now in the middle of an extraterrestrial conflict and you're seeing this to gather intel on the long since marred and altered Space Force. But as of now, in the 21st century, we have not made first contact. There are no real threats from outer space besides the possible meteor, and even then it's hard to see the use of having guys up there in space to, I guess, fire ray guns at space rocks. Now, the Space Force itself is grouped with the Air Force, which makes sense, both are, well, airborne. However, the Space Force isn't just a higher Air Force altitude-wise, it's got its own thing going on. This is straight from the official Space Force website, this information I'm about to read. I didn't know there were .mil links. I thought like anything government would be .gov, but I guess there's .mil too. I don't know. I don't know everything, and I'm just pleased whenever I find out something new, which is what I strive for with these videos. Anyway, the U.S. Space Force was established on December 20th, 2019, when the National Defense Authorization Act was signed into law, creating the first new branch of the armed services since 1947. The establishment of the USSF resulted from widespread recognition that space is a national security imperative. When combined with the growing threat posed by strategic competitors in space, it became clear that there was a need for a military service focused solely on pursuing superiority in the space domain. So from this block of information, you can see that it was made more to protect space travel from foreign interests, which is strange because last I thought our countries were pretty united on that front, like with the ISS, the International Space Station, where astronauts of all nationalities work together to study space and coordinate travel and liftoffs and incoming meteors. I don't know. I don't think that meteors are that common, but it would be cool if they were, and it was like an action movie all the time where they had to save Earth. I guess it would be pretty hard on the astronauts living a high stress life like that, and it would be kind of puzzling to think about what would be happening before space travel. Would we be constantly getting meteor showers? Anyway, that was a tangent. Sorry. Let's get back to it. While the Space Force is the newest service, the Department of Defense has been working in the space domain since the beginning of space exploration. Okay, so you see, it looks like the Space Force is kind of unneeded. It feels like it's part Air Force, part Department of Defense, and part NASA. It feels like it's a bunch of things that didn't need to be mashed together and were. Okay, I'm getting where this sort of hate is coming from, but the Space Force guy in the video seemed cool, and I think there's still potential.
Space.
Yeah.
I've never even heard of that.
Brand new.
Were you in the Air Force and then they were like
Yeah,
Space Force?
So I was in
okay.
training.
Yeah.
I was doing
Okay.
ROTC to
Right.
be in the Air Force.
Okay.
And then 2019 is when they created the Space Force.
Yeah.
You're in the Space Force, like what?
The Space Force consolidates satellite acquisition, budget, and workforce from across more than 60 different organizations into a united, efficient, effective service for space operations. Okay, so I guess the Space Force is this unification I was mentioning earlier, with all these countries coming together for equalized space travel, but I feel like that's gone on for longer than 2019, so that's odd. Alright, what's next? Investments in space capabilities have increased the effectiveness of operations in every other domain. The US military is faster, better connected, more informed, more precise, and more lethal because of its ability to harness space effectively. That the same premise that space is critical holds true for the average American. Space capabilities are woven into the fabric of daily life. Satellites connect people in every corner of the globe, from monitoring weather patterns to carrying television broadcasts. They also provide the positioning, navigation, and timing of the GPS constellation that powers global financial networks, enable international commerce, synchronize cell phone networks, and optimize critical infrastructure systems. Access to and freedom to operate in space underpins our national security and economic prosperity. Yet, potential adversaries are seeking ways to deny the US access to the space capabilities that are fundamental to both warfighting and our modern way of life. These adversaries have developed an array of threats, both on Earth and in orbit, that continue to grow in scope, scale, and complexity. The military and civilian guardians who work for the Space Force protect and defend American interests in space to ensure that our forces, our allies, and our people have the ability to harness space whenever and wherever they need it. Right. I remember this. Pretty sure from that same Jubilee video. The Space Force isn't just this sort of military Air Force astronaut sort of thing, it's also in cyberspace. It gets more sci-fi. But the soldiers for the Space Force are like online guardians too, which is needed in modernity. So now, looking beyond the face value of the Space Force, I can clearly see how it's needed and how this sort of mockery is unjustified. Now, because apparently I like to undermine my own point, I do remember some contention with how it was founded. Looking back, I know it's a while ago now, but to 2019, that was Trump administration, which had its fair share of issues that are still going on till today, where the former president is being charged with events surrounding his insurrection. While it's not technically related to the Space Force because he was the president who signed it into law, it does sort of taint it. However, the Space Force actually extends well beyond 2019 and that precedent, going all the way back to the end of World War II, with Army General Henry Arnold's identification of space flight as detrimental to the military success of the United States of America. And in 1954, the Air Force started to form a space organization, which is why the Space Force is nested under the Department of the Air Force today. This space organization was the Western Development Division, followed by the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and the Naval Research Laboratory, which were all both the country's and the military's first ventures into space travel. Then, of course, Sputnik was launched in 1957, which kicked off the space race, and the rest is pretty well-known history. In 1959, the newly formed NASA absorbed these other space agencies. However, the Air Force was left pretty much unharmed, making it the primary executor for military space control. This part is very interesting. In the Cold War, the Army and the Navy had space missions because they were responsible for satellite communications, which is crazy to me. Why those branches? The subdivisions of government are astounding at how it's broken down and which jobs are given which agencies. But like in 1962, the Navy Astronautics Group was formed. Isn't that crazy? Like water space. I don't know. I just find that cool. Obviously, it was mainly for military use of space and communication between naval craft and satellites, and activities such as this went on through the entire Cold War. There was one point, actually, where the Air Force almost became the Aerospace Force. So, yeah, at this point, you understand that the Space Force isn't just some wacky new thing. This had been in the works for over half a century. This was even amid rumors of President Ronald Reagan making a U.S. Space Force, which is kind of ironic when you put these two controversial civilian Republican presidents next to each other. Then, in 1982, Air Force Space Command was established, which sounds super cool and pretty sci-fi. Then, this was developed into the United States Space Command in 1985, with Air Force, Army, and Navy branches beneath it. There were multiple projects launched underneath the United States Space Command, such as the modern GPS. In the Persian Gulf War, we saw space warfare as intended executed, which is less like ray guns and more like satellite positioning. It ended up providing coordination for an international army of 500,000 troops, awarding the conflict the moniker the First Space War. However, even within this space war, there was already division forming. There were talks of collapsing space operations and condensing them into the Air Force from doubts of the effectiveness of these forces. They were investigated by a newly formed Space Commission in 2001, and it was concluded that the Space Force should be its own thing. However, that was over 20 years ago, and only just recently did we get a Space Force. So, why did it take so long? Well, also in 2001, in the city I'm currently in, there was a reasonably big terrorist attack that took the country and the world by storm. In fact, it got everybody's attention to the point where instead of a space war, a global war on terror was fought. In fact, in this war on terror, the various space commands that were formed under Reagan were dissolved to make way for resources for other branches of the military, all but Air Force Space Command, which was used to provide satellite communications in the Iraqi conflicts. In the collapse of these space commands, Russia and China stepped in to make their own, and since these countries have been sort of enemies to the state ever since the Cold War, America felt obligated to continue in this sort of now defunct space race that we saw at the beginning of this thing. A proposal to make a United States Space Corps was in the works in 2017, and in that same year it was rejected and pushed into the next year to be further deliberated. It was called premature, which, from my perspective going into this idea, I could understand. It's a bit early for space warriors. However, as we've seen, the Space Force in its limited capacity already has done much more than shoot Martians or stop supernovas or what have you. It plays an important role in modern combat. Again, that being said, the next part of the history isn't too pretty. Of course, the Space Force does have an iffy history, what with it being, first and foremost, a military operation. But to make a whole video on this force and then do your research and see that President Trump called it a great idea and said that it could happen, well, it just made me question things. With this sort of controversial take, the Space Force was formally created under the Department of the Air Force in 2019. Now, knowing this, I kind of had to cover some issues with Trump being associated with the Space Force. In fact, he was quoted at one point that nobody even thought about the Space Force before him, which, funnily enough, in this video I have gone through and historically disproven. Accordingly, the Space Force was said to be a vanity project for him and wholly useless, despite its extensive history to even before Sputnik and JFK and even Reagan with all his space commands. The Trump administration was so heavily associated with the Space Force that they sold unofficial Space Force merchandise, and all his supporters loved the formation of the force. Again, not looking great for it. However, if we're able to put that in the past, now listen, I don't really care for a stance on issues like that present. I think we can all reach common ground in other places that we don't need politics for. And whether you hate the guy or love the guy, I think that you're human and you can make your choices based on what you know and what you want. So that's pretty much it. So anyway, beyond that, in 2021, there was a quote that I wanted to highlight because of everything I've been saying about the Space Force thus far from Wendy Whitman-Cobb. Modern pop culture depictions of the Space Force as a joke are distracting from the serious responsibilities the USSF is taking on. which, yeah, it's subject to mockery, even from the other military personnel in that Jubilee video.
Are you stationed here, or were you stationed in
Los Angeles
Colorado?
Space Force Base. Yeah.
Oh, that's
But we have a base in Colorado too.
Okay.
Yeah, you guys are unicorns. Like, you're literally the only one I've ever met.
Unicorn, yeah.
No offense to anyone in the Space Force, but no one knows anything about them.
But I think I'm not the only one who sees it in this sort of sci-fi lens and is enthralled by it and just yearns to know more. I understand where she's coming from, but I also think that the pop culture perception is what brings it life. Perhaps in a propaganda sort of way, but also in a fun, intrigue way. So that's the past of the Space Force. What does that mean for it now? Well, in my research, there's been a bunch of articles that have come up with newer issues that people have with the branch and its operations, much like the members of the government did after the first Space War. We've seen the various consolidations and incorporations of other military units into the Space Force predecessors over the years, and now there's talk of the Air National Guard being incorporated into it. However, this was slammed by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, obviously red, saying that it was, quote, a threat to the Texas National Guard. He went on to say that it was nigh unlawful for the Biden administration to do something like this, and he refused to allow it. Governor Abbott has cited rulings that transfers such as this would need to be approved by the state governor. However, given the history of this institution, it's pretty clear that he's so fervent on this because of the negative perception of the Space Force and how it's useless in the current landscape of America. In fact, governors from 48 states, excluding Abbott, wrote to the Secretary of Defense in opposition of this movement. It's so rare to see all these politicians agree on something like this, which starts to make me doubt my findings, but to me, it looks like the Space Force will only continue to be more important to American military success in the future. However, perhaps my research is biased or not in depth enough, and if someone has contradictory findings, please do let me know. And it doesn't end there. I found an article from the Federal News Network that said that National Guardsmen will do anything in their power to avoid joining the Space Force, including retraining and fully retiring. And knowing how much the Space Force actually does, I find that ridiculous. You're not just an astronaut or a field biologist or whatever. Those resources are being allocated to a reasonable place in the modern era of combat. In fact, their refusal to join the Space Force will only hurt the power of the American military and, of course, the Space Force as well, which the military will only become further reliant on in the future. So, all in all, is the Space Force as cool as I thought it was? Kind of not. But that doesn't mean it's unnecessary, and it will only get more important as time goes on. It's a shame that the only time we can get higher-ranking politicians to agree is when they stand firmly against change, and I hope we can move to a better future eventually. And perhaps we'll live long enough to see actual space battles instead of just coordination by satellite. What are your thoughts about the Space Force? Let me know in the comment section down below, and until next time, adieu.